This slide is showing the blood supply to the kidney. So we want to first begin with the oxygenated blood, which is coming off of the abdominal aorta. It leads into the renal artery, which you can see shown right here. The renal artery then leads to the segmental artery, which is going to be located a little deeper into the kidney at this area. So renal artery, segmental artery here as well. Then the segmental artery leads to the interlobar artery, which is between the lobes of the kidney. So this would be the interlobar, all of these that are located sort of between the pyramids where the renal column would be located at. Then the interlobar artery leads to the arcuate artery, and the arcuate artery is found right at the corticomedullary junction here. So we are progressively getting to blood vessels that are smaller and smaller. Then we have the interlobular artery, which is actually now within the renal cortex. The arcuate artery would be between the cortex and the medulla. The interlobar artery would be in the renal column. So now from the interlobular artery, we are now getting into an area which we refer to as the nephron, which we'll be talking more about coming up. Off of the interlobular artery, we have what's called the afferent arteriole, and that means that it goes to the glomerulus. The glomerulus is the first part of the nephron, and it's where filtration occurs, which is a high pressure, passive membrane transport where it forces fluids across a membrane. So it goes to the glomerulus, then it leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. So the efferent arteriole is away from the glomerulus. At this point, it's going to then lead into one of two different capillary groups based on the type of nephron that it is. In this particular type of nephron, we have a nephron loop that is pretty short. The difference between these two types of nephrons is the length of the nephron loop. So the peritubular capillaries would be in a what's called a cortical nephron, and the vasa recta would be in what's called a juxtamedullary nephron, which essentially means that it is in the nephron. So you don't need to remember that word juxtamedullary. Just recognize if you see it that it's a nephron in the medulla. The peritubular capillaries means that it's a shorter nephron in the cortex, which is what we see here. So after all of this has happened here, there's been blood that's all removed from the filtrate. The filtrate is what eventually becomes the urine. Now what's remaining is going to essentially be deoxygenated blood, which is going to eventually go to the inferior vena cava. Goes out through the interlobular vein, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, and then finally renal vein. Notice that there is no segmental vein. And the locations for the interlobar, the arcuate, and the interlobular are the same as the locations that are up here as well. Nephrons are extremely important. They are the functional units of the kidney where filtration occurs, and each nephron consists of a renal corpuscle, which contains a glomerulus and a capsular space of that glomerulus, and a renal tubule. The renal tubule has various parts. The first part is called the proximal convoluted tubule, abbreviated as PCT, a nephron loop, a distal collecting tubule, abbreviated as DCT, collecting tube, and then finally collecting duct. So portions are going to be shared by multiple nephrons, which include the last parts, the collecting tubules, collecting ducts, and then the papillary duct. So when we look at this slide, it shows the two different types of nephrons here. We have a cortical nephron shown on the left and a juxtamedullary nephron, which is on the right. Notice that the cortex is the location for the cortical nephron, and the juxtamedullary nephron is located in the medulla. So the first part of the nephron is going to be this renal corpuscle containing a glomerulus. Then the renal tubule is all the tubes that lead out of that. So it begins with the proximal convoluted tubule because it's closest to the glomerulus, nephron loop, and the nephron loop begins with a descending limb and then an ascending limb, which leads to the distal convoluted tubule, abbreviated as DCT, PCT for proximal convoluted tubule, and then that leads into the collecting tubule and then collecting duct. So you should know the order of the different parts of the renal tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule begins at the tubular pore of the renal corpuscle, and its walls are simple cuboidal epithelium with tall microvilli, which is a continuous brush border. And this is super important for the function of the proximal convoluted tubule because it reabsorbs almost all the nutrients that leak through the filtration membrane. Reabsorbed nutrients and water enter the peritubular capillaries and are returned to the general circulation. So the nephron components are shown on this slide, and let's go through them in order. So this doesn't include the renal, really refer to the renal corpuscle too much. It does have it. Remember that the renal corpuscle is going to contain the glomerulus and a capsular space. As far as the renal tubule, begins with the proximal convoluted tubule. So remember that the nephron begins with the renal corpuscle. So there are two parts. And the second part is the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle has the glomerulus in it. It also has the capsular space that's in it. The renal tubule begins with the PCT, the nephron loop, and then finally the DCT. So we can see the proximal convoluted tubule shown first, the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule. That distal convoluted tubule is going to lead into a collecting tube and then a collecting duct. So you don't need to know what is reabsorbed, what the functions are in the different parts of the nephrons, but you do need to know the general anatomy, the histology of the different parts. So let's look at the histology of the renal corpuscle first here. Shown on the image to your right is the glomerulus, which is what's highlighted on the image to your left here. The afferent arteriole brings blood into the glomerulus. The efferent arteriole takes blood out of the glomerulus and leads to the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta. This is showing the cross-section of the proximal convoluted tubule, which we can also see shown right here. So this would be another PCT. Surrounding the glomerulus is the capsular space, which would be this space right here, the capsular space. And then you can also see a cross-section of the DCT shown on the image to your left. So this slide is showing a glomerulus here. And we can also see a proximal convoluted tubule as well as a distal convoluted tubule.